Welcome to the Journal of Biophilic Design podcast. Many thanks for joining us on the Journal of Biophilic Design today. To let you know that the Cities edition is out. You can view that on Kindle, you can buy it on Amazon, but also, of course, you can buy it directly from us on the journal of biophilicdesign.com. We print on eco-friendly paper, eco-friendly inks and stuff like that, as well as you can also look at electronic version online too. We're really excited today to be joined by Morgan Taylor. He's director of Greengage. I'm going to let him explain what exactly he does, but it's where sustainability matters, and obviously biophilic design being one of the key elements in helping businesses, cities achieve their net zero and mitigate against climate change. I think you're going to find what Greengage does very interesting and incredibly relevant. So Morgan, many thanks for joining us today, first of all.
Thanks for having me.
Lovely. Can you tell us a bit about yourself and also about what Greengage does?
So I'm Morgan Taylor. I'm a director here at Greengage. I lead the biodiversity side of the business. So we're a small multidisciplinary environmental consultancy. So we cover everything from energy and carbon assessments, sustainability, health and wellbeing, and socio-economic assessment, and EIA management, as well as the whole gamut of biodiversity assessment through planning. So I lead the biodiversity side of the business. There's the best part of 30 of us now on the team. When I first joined, there was 2 of us doing surveys of small single homeowner schemes in London, and now we work on large complex master plans, and increasingly our work is focused outside of the legislative and planning policy sphere in the world of natural capital and ecosystem service value assessment. So rather than working with developers where we are only brought in because there is a potential impact on biodiversity in the first place, we're working with a lot of people with regards to asset management, land management, informing how financial capital is put towards recovery of natural capital across managed assets.
Really good. So it's a really positive intervention, isn't it? You're kind of coming at it from the beginning as well.
Yeah, well, precisely. I mean, we were frustrated by the only reason that we were brought in to support on projects as ecologist in the planning sphere is because there is the national planning policy framework and a piece of legislation that say it was if it was nesting birds, it was because of the Wildlife and Countryside Act that required someone to act. Part of our kind of main drive was to firstly identify those what we describe as ecosystem service co-benefits from nature, and find ways to leverage those benefits and get people to act outside of them just having to do so because a piece of policy or a law requires them to mitigate their impact. Of course, that accounts for what we call the shifting baseline syndrome. So the fact that just saying that we restore nature to how we found it before development now does not account for the fact that we've got hundreds, if not thousands of years of degradation, or certainly hundreds of years of degradation that accounts for the baseline that we see now. So we need to not only address any impacts that we're having for our actions, but also account for the significant loss in biodiversity since particularly the Industrial Revolution.
Absolutely. I was at Planted in the summer and I met an amazing chap called Steve Tonkin. He talks about light pollution, but he was saying about how the colour of the light, even just all these little things that we don't think about, how the blue light can actually kill the insects. And he made the point, obviously, when you're driving along, you don't get the insects on your bonnet and you don't have to wipe them off your windscreen like we used to, if you know what I mean.
Well, that was the that assessment has actually been used. That was the way that they measured the decline in insects. There's a very famous study out of Germany that found that there was 80% declines in insect biomass, and it was through declines in the number plate test effectively that showed that. And it is noticeable, and that's the tangible outcome here. And lighting is one of many big impacts. So the movement towards LEDs is good, so that you want low UV components in lighting, because you're right that kind of tending towards the blue side of the spectrum is far more attractive to insects, and accordingly attractive to birds, bats, whatever it might be that are preying on those insects, which then results in impacts across the entire food web, to say the least.
It's great. I mean, obviously, some people probably listen to this, we wouldn't even know how you would start to analyze and kind of monitor and advise and things. I mean, it sounds to me like you've got, where you approach it, you have all the knowledge of the legislation, you have, obviously the biology side of things, the ecology side of things, and then you have obviously the business side of things, and you kind of somehow pull it all together. Could you sort of explain, like, kind of maybe even give us an example of how that sort of works? I mean, what do? Do you sort of kind of have a consultancy thing? Do you go in and measure things, or do you?
Yeah, so let's take the biodiversity team. So we're split broadly down the middle into the planning ecology team and the natural capital team. So the planning ecologists, we are driven by the framework of legislation and planning policy. So we've got several pieces of core legislation in place in the UK, and then also devolved pieces of legislation for England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. So primarily, we're talking about three pieces of legislation. One, the Wildlife and Countryside Act, the Habitats and Species Conservation Regs, which is linked to European legislation, and the Environment Act, which is from 2021. These three pieces of legislation drive most actions with regards to protected species, protected habitats, and importantly, the Environment Act is the legislation that will require all new development as of November this year to deliver measurable gains in biodiversity. So from a consultancy perspective, when people are looking to bring forward new development, we have these three legal frameworks that require action. The action, however, other than simply requires that you effectively don't harm the biodiversity, the receptors that are protected. So where we're looking at protected species, there's not necessarily a requirement to deliver measurable improvements for those species. That's where the Environment Act is really quite interesting, because there'll be a need for developments to assess their baseline biodiversity value, measured using a habitat-based metric known as the biodiversity metric, which you assess the habitat extents, typologies, condition and distinctiveness on a site pre-development. You say, okay, we have this many biodiversity units on the site. The idea is that after development, you have 10% more biodiversity units, either delivered on that site or in combination with on-site and off-site through an offset process. You then also have planning policy. So not a legal requirement, of course, but through consent linked to planning, there are kind of legal obligations to comply with planning policy related outcomes. So planning policy will differ depending upon where you are in the country. We've got a singular national planning policy framework, which is consistent and also requires that new development delivers gains for biodiversity. However, it doesn't specify how those gains should be measured or the extent to which those gains should be delivered. Then most regions, cities, local planning authorities have their own planning policy, which vary significantly. So some local authorities might have pretty poor, backwards biodiversity targets. Others, let's take Oxfordshire, for example, require 20% gains in biodiversity on new development. So local authorities are interpreting the Environment Act in different ways. So that's the development side of things. So that's where, if someone's going to build something, we're brought in to assess the presence or absence of protected or notable habitats, species, other receptors like protected sites, and then effectively say, okay, this is how you've got to mitigate the impact. This is how firstly avoid it. Sorry, you have to follow the mitigation hierarchy. So this is how you actually avoid causing an impact at all. If that's unavoidable, this is how you mitigate that. If we can't mitigate it to the extent where it's acceptable, this is how we compensate. And we're there along the whole process, guiding development teams, design teams to say, okay, to address this is what you embed into your new plans. These are the principles for living roofs that you should follow to ensure that we're integrating green infrastructure into new development. Or even simply, this is where you put integrated swift boxes or house sparrow boxes, whatever it might be, right up to complex approaches of this is how you recreate woodland. So that's the planning ecology team focus. Natural capital team is slightly more esoteric, and there's no single approach to kind of how we act or even why we necessarily act. So here we're reliant upon a more complex web of effectively that you've got the carrot or the stick. So we have the stick being regulatory drivers for those that own, develop, manage land or assets. These typically exist outside of the piece of the legislation that I mentioned for planning. These are more regulatory drivers for financial organizations. So, for example, there's a task force for climate-related financial disclosure. So it's now mandated that FTSE 100 companies disclose against TCFD, which is effectively a framework for saying this is how we interact with climate and how climate change interacts with us. So it's a disclosure of saying our assets are causing this much impact, and the impact of climate change is going to cause this much impact upon them. So it's basically tracking interaction with climate change. Importantly, it will be disclosing where built form assets, particularly in the sphere that we work in, where built form assets are under tangible risk from climate change. So is there heightened risk of urban heat island effect? Is there heightened risk of surface water flooding? And how does that accordingly affect the value of the property and therefore the business? So effectively, it's a mandated disclosure process that means that investors can actually say, okay, we're coming into this with eyes wide open. In a changing climate, this portfolio is under huge amounts of risk from climate change, and therefore its value is reduced and we're less likely to invest in it. So the idea being that it's market-led change. So TCFD doesn't require you to act on the risks that are identified. However, it does require you to disclose on said risks. There's a new sister disclosure recommendation called the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, which is what's really getting us excited now, which is the same approach, but rather than disclosing purely climate-related impacts, it's saying this is how we impact on nature, and this is how loss of nature impacts on us, simply put. And importantly, it's not just in the direct operations of a business, it's also through your value chain. So it's saying this is how our decisions on what we source and where we source it from impacts nature at a global scale. And this is how loss of nature at a global scale might impact our value chains. So again, it's incredibly complex, but those are the two of the primary kind of sticks, top down drivers, alongside the general requirement for large companies to have ESG disclosures, so environmental, social, and governance disclosure reports every year alongside their financial disclosures, because of course big firms have a fiduciary, what we call a fiduciary duty to disclose against their broader environmental impact, and that's where we come in and say, okay, this is where as a business you are interacting with biodiversity. These are where you're impacting it. This is where it's impacting you. And importantly, this is where you have an opportunity to deliver benefits for biodiversity and how those benefits for biodiversity can directly support you as a business, which is where we get to the carrot. So we've now got the bottom up drivers. So let's take an asset manager in central London. They've got a portfolio of 100 properties. Our role might be to say, for one, these are the regulatory drivers, so that the TCFD, the TNFD disclosures and the data that we will capture for those assets and the running of those assets. But also, how could nature be integrated into these assets, and what would doing so, how would that benefit you as a business? So we would look at where could living roofs be retrofitted, say. In doing so, you get what we call, so that's obviously a primarily a nature-based solution. So that is an intervention that is for biodiversity. But it's not just biodiversity that benefits from doing that, because through delivering a living roof, you have improved building performance in terms of energy, in terms of heating and cooling. If you've got PVs integrated, you've also got improved efficiency of those photovoltaic panels because of the evapotranspiration from the planting. And in actual fact, it is mutually beneficial because the PVs can improve performance of the living roof as well. You also have sound improvements, and you have slowing down of stormwater surface flows. So it's possible to measure and capture all of those co-benefits from a nature-based solution and leverage those benefits accordingly. So it might be through insurance because there's measurable reduction in surface flood risk of the property. It might be through improvements in marketable rates for tenants because of the evidential reduction in AC costs or heating costs. So that's one example of where we'd say we take a single building in this case and say these are the nature-based solutions that you can do. These are the top-down, the bottom-up drivers, the ways that you can leverage those outcomes and measure them. And we're happy because biodiversity is benefiting. They're happy because they're not only complying with what they have to comply with, but and keeping up with the Joneses, because let's be honest, that's another important driver here is that everyone wants to be the best when it comes to it, because handily it's very fashionable to be cognizant of biodiversity now. But also this is the ways that we can tangibly benefit as an asset manager. So the model should be that everyone wins. It's obviously a bit harder than that because there's the comms of it all. So you're right that you do have to understand the biology of it. We have to understand the chemical changes, the physical implications of a nature-based solution, but importantly also how that interacts with the way a business is run, and then the rhetoric of it all, basically. So there's it takes a kind of unique set of skills, I suppose, to be able to understand all of that. And I've not even mentioned how nature-based solutions are potentially key at also contributing towards net zero strategies, so capturing more carbon and storing it.
Yeah, well, we're going to talk about that in a bit, actually, about that sort of how those different interventions can make a difference. You've already touched on that about the sort of sound and heat and sort of storm water and things. I just it's really interesting. We're just listening to you speak. It just sounds like it's a whole sort of like myriad and like it's a patchwork of sort of legislation, knowledge base. And I think it's a really topical and grown-up approach, if you want to look at the values, that we're almost taking it around the other way. Because a lot of people I speak to, it's almost like, oh yeah, we've got this solution, we're bringing it in here, and this is what that does. What you're doing is you're sort of you're taking it back to the businesses and the investors and saying, look, by doing this is how much it could increase because this is this and this, these are the factors you should be looking at. I think it's a brilliant way actually of getting, from our point of view now, kind of getting it across the line. Obviously lots of people are talking about climate resilience and all this kind of thing, and there seems to be a hell of a lot of greenwashing. People going, oh yeah, we've put a living wall in, and they sometimes don't manage it, or they don't really understand what it's for. Do you find more businesses are though genuinely wanting to make a change? I mean, there's like a sort of genuine need or a genuine desire to
yeah there is. I mean, most big businesses, and when I kind of speak of businesses, again, the sector we work primarily in is real estate or land ownership. So that is not necessarily businesses that produce something, it's businesses that own something, and that was a conscious decision to work with these organizations because they are the ones that own most of the land, and that is where we can actually make the changes. So there has been a noticeable shift in the last decade from in both the planning design teams as well as in the kind of boardroom at an ESG, a kind of corporate strategy perspective. There's been considerable changes. So years ago at a design team meeting for a new development, there would be noticeable eye rolling when the ecologist spoke about the constraints, and very rarely was there opportunity to talk about the opportunities. It was mostly about how do we not kill this bat, not about how can we actually deliver improvements for nature in a way that's good for nature and us. There was just no acknowledgement of that, and it was frustrating and quite demoralizing at times. But now, not only is there increasing acknowledgement of the importance of nature, partly driven by the fact that there's a tougher legislative framework, but partly driven by the fact that people are finally getting it. That's not to say that there aren't plenty of developers out there that don't get it, and it's still short-termism when it comes to it's cheaper to skimp on the environmental mitigation and design on the basis that they'll still probably develop the home, set it on, and it's not their issue. So particularly with house builders at scale, it's harder to sell the narrative of why it's beneficial to integrate nature. But those that develop and hold on to assets, it's much easier because they obviously then have an onward reason for delivering something that's good, that's going to pay them back better rental incomes, and also that is more resilient, like you say. So there are varying. There's a change overall, but some sectors are changing faster than others.
Obviously, do you think there's a way that designers can make it easier for this whole process? So when you come on board, obviously you're coming on, you're advising them, but say you're not there at that stage or whatever, as a designer, how can we, is there a framework? Are there things that we can go, or, obviously I'm not a designer, but, people can go along to sort of say, well, look, if we implement this, put this seed and green roof on, or if we put this living wall on, or if we put these trees in, or, is there something that they can go to kind of help explain what they do, what I mean, rather than just going, oh, this is going to look pretty and this will help you? Is there kind of something tangible they can go to help them?
There are lots of resources. So there's a really good resource from Natural England recently on green infrastructure design, and they shared an entire green infrastructure strategy for England, and that includes specification documents that basically says this is what good looks like. However, there's nothing that's going to be just driving for an actual to get a consultant in. There are ways that you can kind of say, okay, at a high level, you need to do this or this. And again, I point towards documentation from Natural England or UK GBC or whoever it might be. Again, there are some really good guidance documents from the UK Green Building Council on nature-based solutions and green infrastructure design. So they're a good go-to reference point. But particularly for planning projects, you're going to need early engagement, and by early I mean feasibility. I mean our REBA stage kind of 0 or 1, to say this is the biodiversity baseline, because with BNG for planning projects, with BNG biodiversity net gain mandated in the Environment Act, it's now actually, it's not going to be a question of, oh, can we put in biodiversity and can we squeeze it in around the pre-existing layout of homes or offices or whatever that we've already committed to building. It's a question of, can we deliver this project at all, because of the challenge of compensating for any loss in high biodiversity value. And that's the idea of legislation, in that it will say that some sites shouldn't be developed because their biodiversity baseline is simply so high, or other sites can be developed, but they need to be considered from the early outset. So the idea being, when you look at delivering a new scheme, it shouldn't be that you put in everything that you need, all of the grey infrastructure, all the buildings, all the roads, and then you squeeze green in where you can. You should be starting with a fully green plan, and you carve out the grey only where it's strictly necessary. So that's the way that we should be designing. We always say that people that are designing in all of the grey infrastructure, all of the utilities, all of those requirements, and forgetting the green infrastructure, it until the very end is madness. Because for a start, there are green solutions as alternatives to grey, so particularly from a drainage and flood risk perspective. And there are ways that green and grey can complement each other. But also the green infrastructure delivers much bigger and more important services for society than grey infrastructure at an asset perspective. So we always say you wouldn't build a project that couldn't link into the broadband or connect to the sewers. So why would you do it if it didn't also connect to the green infrastructure network, which is unquestionably as important at a bigger picture scale? But obviously it doesn't quite translate to that when you're looking at figures on a spreadsheet.
I like what you say about sort of obviously bringing everybody together. I know we spoke before, and you do speak about a task force for nature, which is kind of what you're saying here, isn't it? It's almost like the designers, architects, researchers, we're all sort of pulling together, and sort of analysts and advisors, consultants, and all these different knowledge bases, the legal side of things. What's your vision for that?
Well, the TNFD, the Task Force on Nature, that's that's a disclosure requirement rather than necessarily a project-based kind of task force. However, it is good to frame kind of these, I hate the phrase, but holistic design teams as task forces are basically, because the vision for development teams particularly should be that that it's not just the quantity surveyors that are brought in at the early stage and say, oh, is this financially viable? It's looking at not just the financial capital of a project, but the natural capital of a project. Now, viewing natural capital purely in financial terms comes with a huge amount of risks, and I don't wholly support financial valuation of ecosystem service benefits. However, valuing the potential benefit of a nature-based solution in terms of its natural capital stock and ecosystem service flow should be something that we're looking at on every project, and that every part of the design team are not just cognizant of, but ideally have some base level understanding of. So there should be acknowledgement, particularly from and in the landscape industry particularly, there should be more acknowledgement of, one, the carbon impacts of delivering landscape, and then also the climate resilience and nature linked opportunities, and importantly missed opportunities that are being that are on so many schemes, where we've got what I call the beach hedge hegemony of still just putting in monocultural hedging, skimmiers, all these kind of boring, you see the same landscape you build scheme, and it's just like, why the hell are you doing this? Because it's going to fail, it will look rubbish in a few years' time. There are solutions, there are cost-effective, easy ways to deliver landscapes, so that there is lack of communication in the kind of design evolution for new developments. So the vision should be that there's much more integrated thinking. There's education not just in the ecological community, but in the QSs, in the quantity surveyors, in the landscape designers, in the architects, and in the development managers themselves, as to why biodiversity is a meaningful and valuable part of new design.
Thank you. Maybe we could talk about actual biophilic design itself, and kind of those, you touched on it earlier, and so it'd be really nice to kind of get your take on how you see biophilic design really enhancing everything, like all these different aspects.
Well, yeah, so biophilia is as a concept, it's not one that generally gets used by ecologists. So again, it's one of these things where I think we're missing a trick as an industry by not upselling the biophilic co-benefit of nature-based design, so of new landscaping, and that we do tend to think of, we just have to deliver landscape for the best outcomes for biodiversity, which is not untrue, but we have to acknowledge that in order to get decent landscapes over the line, in order to get buy-in, and also in cities particularly, in order to actually deliver something that's climate resilient and doesn't require a lot of irrigation, a lot of maintenance, we need to deliver something that's not necessarily what the ecological textbook on habitat design from the 1980s says is the right thing to do. Obviously, in a fully rural environment, it's totally different, and we should be looking at native focused design and kind of more typical UK habitat design. But from an urban green infrastructure perspective, with biophilia in mind, we should be looking at landscapes that are more akin to the kind of the Nigel Dunnett or Pierre Udolph type new perennialist approach to landscape creation, which are just like the optimal approaches to urban landscape design as we see it, that tick all of the boxes of biophilia in the sense of the texture and the variation and the sensory input, but also really valuable for biodiversity. They're effectively creating almost kind of brownfield type landscapes with this mix of herbaceous perennials and bare ground areas and low nutrient substrates typically, because we're creating this step type planting. From a living roof perspective, biophilia doesn't often come into the mix because they're often, and again, living roofs are one of the key allies for the ecologist in urban green infrastructure, but typically you don't see them because they're on the roof. However, what we've started to do more and more is where a roof is overlooked or where there's opportunity to integrate roof level greening on terraces, rather than saying just put in some planters. We've been pushing for low level biodiverse roof design, where you not only plan the planting layout to look good throughout the seasons, to be beneficial for biodiversity first and foremost, but also you plan the substrate. So I mean, the term brown roof has fallen out of favor, with biodiverse roof being more kind of commonly used now. But we shouldn't just be seeing singular uniform substrate types. We push for swaths and kind of land art patterns across living roofs, so that over the winter you've actually got something that looks interesting as well, and everything's out of flower or everything's cut back. So there are lots of ways that we can be using, and again, that is effectively recreating brownfield land, or type of habitat called open mosaic on previously developed land, which is a really important habitat. But you're creating that in a designed way so that people like the look of it and engage with it, but then also it's actively good for nature to do so.
It's nice, isn't it? Like you say, to create something that's nice in the different seasons as well, that is nice for the human, the sort of human-centric side of things. I think as well, because the more we see things that look pleasing and beautiful, and we understand it and we appreciate it, we can focus on it. We can talk about it as well. I think that then gets people excited to say, well, why haven't we got one? So, you know, they tell their friends. It's like a snowball effect, isn't it, really? Do you have an example that you could share with us, where all these sort of threads have come together, like, you know, where it's like maybe even from the beginning of the planning process, or just, you know, just the final product was amazing that you went on and used? Have you got just an example you could just sort of talk around for us?
Well,
it's probably a gazillion.
There are many. I mean, some of our, I mean, I'll use kind of one of our, there's a large asset manager in central London. We produce their corporate strategy, being brought in from, and again, as part of that strategy, we defined not only how they would look at the assets that they manage as a portfolio manager in terms of retrofitting and improving green infrastructure, but we said, when you deliver new developments, this is the idealized timeframe that you follow. We were brought in at stage one. We said, okay, these are the constraints, and importantly, these are the opportunities. And went on to the living roof last week. And in the 25 minutes I was up there, this is a living roof that's right next to Borough Market on the South Bank. There were, I think, I certainly counted 10 species of pollinator, both hoverflies and bees, several butterfly species, which is quite a kind of impressive sight when you're 6 stories up and kind of with no real notable green infrastructure around you. And also it looked fantastic. And everyone's really thrilled because the office space that looks onto the living roof can obviously be rented out at a much bigger rate than if it were just looking out onto a blank terrace. So it was really rewarding to see, oh, this is what happens when you're engaged at an early point, where you have a systematic strategy in place for how, as an organization, we view biodiversity and how we intend to deliver it on new developments. It's very rewarding.
Oh, fantastic. It really, like you say, if you can get in there early and you can persuade people, and then, you know, like you say, using those testimonials and those examples to kind of swing it earlier. What a lovely thing. I mean, you said you don't expect to kind of see butterfly. I mean, thinking about it, I suppose, they do fly, they got wings, and I suppose some of them do go across the North Sea. So but how amazing for that to be able to, if you're in your office, to be able to witness that. What a lovely thing.
And what's really nice is that lots of surrounding residents were emailing the contractors saying how great the roof was looking from their rooftops, or from their flats, or from their offices. And there was an email chain from the contractor saying, we often get emails, but they're rarely saying positive things. It's mostly saying, can you stop being so noisy, or this is an eyesore. So it was really nice to see that. I've certainly never seen that, so it was really good.
That's really nice. There was a positive win-win all around, really, isn't it? So
exactly.
Bringing nature into a space is good for everybody. I was going to ask you, what got you into it? What's your sort of passion for nature, ecology, and sort of biodiversity? What's your own personal kind of journey on it?
I'm a marine biologist in training, so lots of the terrestrial stuff's almost had to be kind of autodidactic in kind of catching up. Although if you have an understanding of the marine environment, it kind of sets you up to understand any kind of habitat really, because it's far more focused on not just the biology but on the chemistry and physics of habitats, of ecosystems. So that was my background. But as a kid, I grew up in Wiltshire in the countryside. What I now realise is actually quite a destroyed landscape, but was with these kind of big monocultural fields and not enough hedgerows. What people think of as a beautiful green England is actually a kind of ecological disaster, really, in terms of our agricultural practices. But that kind of clearly got me engaged with nature from a young age, and yeah, it was just a passion for biology, I suppose.
Yeah. Okay, it's fantastic. I have to chat separately about the whole blue mind thing.
Yeah, well, I still keep my eye in anything coastal, or particularly the docks and the Thames estuary. There's some really interesting ecology and then there's some really interesting life that's under the water in our cities. Yeah, there's huge diversity of fish in London. Some really interesting species. I mean, we have seahorses in the Thames, which is really quite
Seriously.
cool. Yeah. And so we're working on some developments, and then also with some of the people that own and manage the dock network, which is, it's brackish water, so it's because it's fed by the estuary. Brackish is slightly salty, and we're working to create these kind of microcosms of estuarine habitats in these contained dock areas. So shallower areas that have muddy substrate, areas that have sandy and silty substrate, areas where fish can shelter and feed, and yeah, so there's some really interesting projects on the go.
Yeah, fantastic. I could ask you a gazillion more questions, actually. There's like so many different things we could go down different avenues. But before I ask you the final question, which I ask everybody about the magic brush, is there anything else that you'd like to add?
No, I think the key thing is, if you're working in any environment where you've got the opportunity to influence the design of new development, or of how people are managing development, it's to be aware of the benefits that biodiversity can bring to that process, that aren't just beneficial for nature itself, but are beneficial for those that are developing the site, those that are managing, of course, that are going to be using the site, both passing through it, working, living, whatever it might be. So it's being aware of the multifaceted benefit of biodiversity. It's not just nature for nature's sake. It's nature for our sake. Of course, we should be considering nature for nature's sake, but ignoring the ethical or moral obligation we have. There are myriad reasons that we should be cognizant of it for our own sake, from a purely selfish perspective.
Great, thank you. And so the final question, if you could paint the world with the magic brush of biophilia, what would it look like to you?
That's a really good question. So we would have cities designed with ecosystem service function at heart. So when you're delivering a new development, we would be thinking, like I said earlier, not just about what the utilities and the grey infrastructure we need here, but what are the ecosystem services we need here. So these are the tangible benefits that humanity derives from a nature-based asset. So do we need to improve the surface water collection? Do we need more carbon capture here? Do we need more pollination capacity? Of course, the answer in all cases is going to be yes, we need all of these. So we would have truly integrated green infrastructure on all of our developments. We would have a totally different approach to our countryside and the way we perceive, because of course biophilia, people will perceive the value they will get from going to the countryside. Actually, they might be deriving that perceived value of what good looks like and what green is based upon a habitat that's effectively farmed to death. So I would change people's perceptions of what landscapes should look like. And the key thing, I would change the need to have mown, managed amenity grassland where it's not a space that needs to be used for sport or accessibility. It's an entirely socially constructed, arbitrary way to manage green spaces that not only is obviously detrimental for nature, but it's detrimental for us, and we're missing a massive trick, particularly from the soil carbon perspective. So every heavily managed amenity grassland, we are potentially losing carbon from mismanagement, but we're certainly missing an opportunity to capture more carbon through having decent grassland management and ditching the lawns. So I would say it's not just no May of lawns, it's not having lawns and not having these grasslands unless it's actually needed for use by people, because it's a dramatic waste that is entirely arbitrarily defined by some Victorians' perception of what neat looks like.
Thank you for listening to the Journal of Biophilic Design podcast.